More than half of the U.S. population now lives in a state with legal recreational marijuana. Ohio voted to become the 24th state to legalize the drug on Tuesday. People in those states and D.C. make up roughly 54% of the U.S. Joseph Mello, yes, that's his real name, joins us now. He's an associate professor of political science at DePaul University and has a book coming out in June on the cannabis industry called Pot for Profit. Professor Mello, welcome. So is the marijuana industry changing as more states legalize the drug, particularly for recreational use?
A really interesting question. I guess it depends on what you mean by changing. We're certainly going from having an illicit industry to having a legal industry. So in that sense, we're seeing a lot of change. And these markets are maturing, so we're seeing changes there. But for the most part, I think we're seeing a lot of the same things we saw under Prohibition. We're seeing an industry that is largely stratified to favor corporate interests and mostly people who didn't suffer the consequences of cannabis. And most of the people who suffered the consequences of cannabis prohibition have really struggled to connect with this industry.
Yeah, as we're talking about the people who have suffered the most, the ACLU says Black Americans are about 3 times more likely than white Americans to be arrested for marijuana use. Is legalization actually reducing that gap? And then what happens to people who are currently serving sentences for something that's now become legal?
So you're asking some really great questions, right? I mean, one of the things we would expect with legalization is that we would see a dramatic reduction in arrests. And in fact, we do see a reduction in arrests in most states that have legalized cannabis. But the gap between the arrest rate of Black people and white people hasn't really changed in a lot of these states. And in fact, in some of these states, it's actually grown after legalization. So even though we know that Black and white people use cannabis at about equal rates, like you said, they're 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested than white people. So again, I'm not sure things are getting better.
So, Professor Mello, this segment is about inequalities that exist in the legalized marijuana industry. I wonder if there's also problems, though, that come from a greater recreational marijuana use that also lead to greater inequalities. Is that a criticism that you've heard? And what do lawmakers and people in the industry actually need to do going forward to ensure a more level playing field?
And certainly, as you legalize cannabis, more people are going to use it, and so there is a sort of concern about that. But I think the bigger issue, I mean, in talking to activists and talking to people who are in the industry, is just making sure that we have an equitable industry, because by and large, people of color are the ones who suffered the consequences of prohibition, and most people would like to see legalization benefit those people who struggled the most. And we really haven't seen that. I mean, 1.2 to 1.7%, I think the statistic you just showed, of the industry is Black, of the owners. That's a pretty abysmal number.
All right. Joseph Mello, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.